In 1965, the most popular banana on Earth vanished. Not slowly, not gradually. It was wiped off the face of commercial agriculture in less than a decade by a fungus that lived in the soil and could not be stopped by any chemical, any pesticide, or any amount of money the most powerful fruit company in the world could throw at it. The banana you eat today is not the banana your grandparents grew up eating. It is the replacement, the backup plan. And right now, the same thing is happening again. The origin, a jungle in Southeast Asia. The story of the banana does not start in a grocery store or on a plantation in Costa Rica. It starts in a jungle, roughly 8,000 years ago, in the islands of Papua New Guinea and the surrounding regions of Southeast Asia, where wild banana plants grew in the dense, hot, humid forests that blanketed the lowland valleys. And here's the first thing that will ruin bananas for you slightly. Wild bananas were not edible. Not really. They were small, angular, greenish things. And when you cut one open, the entire interior was packed with hard, black seeds, the size of small pebbles. The flesh, such as it was, existed in thin ribbons around those seeds, and it was starchy, tough, and barely worth the effort. If you were walking through a forest 8,000 years ago when you bit into one of these things, you would have had an experience closer to chewing gravel wrapped in cardboard than anything resembling the banana you peeled this morning. But the people living in those forests were not simply eating what they found. They were watching, selecting, experimenting. Over generations, farmers in New Guinea and across island Southeast Asia noticed that some banana plants occasionally produced fruit with fewer seeds than others. They replanted those specimens. They selected for the mildest, the starchiest, the most productive. Generation after generation, century after century, they were doing something that would not have a scientific name for thousands of years. They were breeding a crop. What makes this remarkable is how they did it. Bananas reproduce in two ways. Sexually, through seeds, which produces highly variable offspring, and asexually, through suckers, the small shoots that sprout from the base of a mature plant and are genetically identical to the parent. At some point, ancient farmers in Southeast Asia figured out that if you found a plant that produced good fruit, you could propagate it indefinitely through those suckers without seeds. You could clone it. Every time. Reliably. This was one of the earliest and most consequential insights in the history of agriculture. The banana was not just domesticated. It was engineered, slowly and deliberately, by farmers whose names we will never know, working in forests that no longer exist, solving a problem they would never have described in those terms. They gave the world one of its most important food crops, and history did not even bother to write their names down. By around 5,000 years ago, cultivated bananas had spread across Southeast Asia, reaching India, where they became deeply embedded in both cuisine and culture. Sanskrit texts from ancient India reference bananas with something close to reverence. Buddhist tradition holds that the banana plant provided the Buddha with shade and sustenance. Alexander the Great, who had a habit of stumbling across important agricultural products during his military campaigns, reportedly encountered banana plants in India around 326 BC, and was impressed enough that his historians recorded the observation. Which, honestly, feels very on-brand for Alexander. The man conquered most of the known world and still found time to write home about fruit. The spread, from Asia to the world. From India, the banana followed the ancient maritime trade routes westward. Arab traders, who were the great connective tissue of the ancient and medieval world, carried banana plants across the Indian Ocean to the east coast of Africa sometime around 600 AD. The Swahili word for banana, ndizi, became embedded in East African languages and culture, which is always how you know a crop has truly arrived somewhere. When it gets its own word, it has found a home. The banana spread up through Africa with surprising speed. It adapted brilliantly to the tropical climates of the Congo Basin, West Africa, and the Great Lakes region, where it became a dietary staple for millions of people long before any European explorer arrived to take credit for anything. In Uganda, the cooking banana, a starchy variety closer to the plantain, became so central to the local diet that the Buganda people built an entire cuisine around it. They had dozens of words for different banana preparations. They ate bananas at every meal. Their kings were buried in banana leaves. The banana was not a food in Uganda. It was a civilization. Meanwhile, Arab merchants were carrying the banana northward into the Middle East and eventually to the Mediterranean edges of the world. The Portuguese, who by the 1400s had established trading posts along the West African coast, encountered bananas there and recognized immediately that they had something valuable on their hands. When Portuguese sailors began exploring and colonizing the Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Canary Islands, São Tomé, they brought banana plants with them. And when Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, the banana was not far behind. A Portuguese friar named Friar Tomás de Berlanga is generally credited with bringing banana plants to the Caribbean and Central America around 1516. The Caribbean climate was, as it tends to be for tropical crops, absolutely perfect. Within a few decades, banana plants were growing across the islands of the Caribbean, along the coasts of Central America, and throughout the tropical zones of South America. The banana had crossed the planet. It had traveled from the jungles of New Guinea to the shores of the New World in roughly 8,000 years, carried by traders and sailors and monks and colonizers, none of whom fully understood that they were changing the history of an entire hemisphere. The United Fruit Company. When a banana built an empire for most of the 1800s, bananas were still a novelty in North America and Europe. They were expensive, exotic, and difficult to transport before refrigeration. If you were a middle-class American in 1870 and someone offered you a banana, you would have treated it roughly the way people today treat truffles. You would have eaten it carefully, maybe with a fork and knife, and you would have thought about it for a week afterward. Then two men changed everything, and in doing so, created one of the most ruthless corporate empires in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Minor Keith was an American entrepreneur who, in the 1870s, was building a railroad through Costa Rica on behalf of the Costa Rican government. The project was a catastrophe. Workers were dying of tropical diseases at a horrifying rate, including 3 of Keith's own brothers. The Costa Rican government ran out of money. The whole venture was on the verge of collapse. In a moment of practical desperation, Keith started planting banana plants along the railroad route to feed his workers and generate some cash on the side. What happened next was not planned. Keith realized that the same railroad he had built to carry construction supplies could carry bananas to the Caribbean coast, where ships could take them to New Orleans in just a few days. The timing worked. The economics worked. The bananas arrived in American cities still fresh, still yellow, still edible. And Americans, who had barely tasted a banana before, went absolutely berserk for them. Keith merged his operation with another Boston-based fruit company run by a man named Andrew Preston. And in 1899, the United Fruit Company was born. And this is where the banana stops being a fruit story and becomes something considerably darker. The United Fruit Company did not just sell bananas. It is genuinely important to understand the scale of what it became, because calling it a fruit company is a bit like calling the Roman Empire a city government. At its peak in the early 20th century, United Fruit owned more land in Central America than most Central American governments. It owned railroads, telegraph lines, and port facilities across Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Jamaica. It had its own private army of security forces. It had a lobbying operation in Washington that would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush. It had a steamship fleet. It had an entire country's worth of infrastructure, built by and for the purpose of moving bananas to American breakfast tables. And when Central American governments tried to assert any kind of independence, any kind of control over the land and labor within their own borders. The United Fruit Company had a solution for that too. In Guatemala in 1954, a democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz proposed a land reform program that would have redistributed unused agricultural land, including land that United Fruit was sitting on and not even using, to landless peasant farmers. This was, by any reasonable measure, an entirely sensible policy. United Fruit's response was to lobby the United States government with the argument that Arbenz was a communist threat in America's backyard. The CIA, led by officials with direct ties to United Fruit, organized a coup. Arbenz was overthrown. A military dictator took his place. Guatemala then suffered decades of civil war that killed an estimated 200,000 people. All of this, a democratically elected government toppled. Decades of civil conflict. Hundreds of thousands of lives because a fruit company did not want to give up land it was not even using. The term Banana Republic was not coined as a marketing slogan. It was coined by the American writer O. Henry in 1904 to describe exactly this phenomenon: small Central American nations whose governments had been effectively purchased and controlled by foreign fruit corporations. When you walk into a Banana Republic clothing store today and buy a linen shirt, you are shopping inside a name that was originally an indictment of American corporate imperialism, which is, depending on your sense of humor, either very funny or deeply uncomfortable, possibly both. The Gros Michel, the banana that was actually delicious. But here is the thing about the banana at the center of all this geopolitical catastrophe. The banana that United Fruit was selling. The banana that Americans were eating in the 1940s and 50s. The banana that this entire corporate empire and all its associated wars and coups and assassinations existed to protect and deliver, was not the banana you eat today. It was called the Gros Michel, and by all accounts, it was extraordinary. People who ate the Gros Michel and then lived long enough to compare it to the Cavendish banana we eat now are consistent in their description. The Gros Michel was creamier. It was richer. It had a deeper, more complex sweetness. It was larger than the Cavendish and had a thicker peel that made it more durable and easier to ship. It lasted longer after harvest. It had a genuinely intense banana flavor that was full and aromatic in a way that the Cavendish simply does not replicate. Here's a fun fact that will permanently change the way you think about banana-flavored candy. The reason artificial banana flavor tastes nothing like a banana to you is not because the chemists got it wrong. It is because they got it exactly right. And then the banana changed. Artificial banana flavoring was developed in the 1900s using the Gros Michel as the reference point. It is a faithful chemical approximation of a fruit that no longer exists commercially. When you eat a banana runts candy or banana-flavored anything and think it tastes fake, you are actually tasting a ghost. A chemical echo of a banana variety that the entire industry was forced to abandon. Because in the 1950s, something started killing the Gros Michel. Something that no amount of pesticide, fungicide, crop rotation, or money could stop. The first extinction, Panama disease, and the death of the Gros Michel. The enemy was a soil fungus called Fusarium oxysporum cubense, which scientists gave the somewhat more dramatic name of Panama disease, though frankly, Panama disease sounds like a mild stomach complaint you might pick up at a resort. What it actually was an agricultural apocalypse. Fusarium oxysporum lives in the soil. It enters banana plants through their roots and destroys the plant's vascular system from the inside, cutting off the flow of water and nutrients until the plant collapses and dies. It spreads through contaminated soil, through water, and on the boots of farm workers walking from one plantation to another. And once it is in the soil, it stays there. Not for a season, not for a decade. For decades. Possibly forever. You cannot fumigate it away. You cannot drown it out. You can abandon the field, wait 50 years, and the fungus will still be waiting when you come back. The reason Panama disease was able to destroy the Gros Michel so completely comes back to the same agricultural logic that killed Ireland's potato crop a century earlier. Every single Gros Michel banana on every plantation in every country in the world was a genetic clone of every other one. They were all propagated through suckers, through asexual reproduction, generation after generation, which meant they were all identically vulnerable to the same pathogen. There was no natural variation. There was no resistant individual somewhere in the population that might survive and pass on its resistance to the next generation. If Panama disease could kill one Gros Michel plant, it could kill every Gros Michel plant on Earth. And that is exactly what it did. Plantation by plantation, country by country, through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Gros Michel was wiped out of commercial agriculture. An entire banana variety, the fruit that had built a global industry, eliminated by a fungus in the dirt. The industry had no plan B. Because of course it did not. It never does. The Cavendish and the corporate scramble. What they had instead was a banana that had been sitting on the sidelines, considered too small, too bland, too fragile, and frankly too inferior to bother with commercially. It was called the Cavendish, named after William Cavendish, the 6th Duke of Devonshire, in whose greenhouse in England the variety had been cultivated in the 1830s. The Cavendish had been around for over a century. Nobody particularly wanted it. Now everybody needed it. The retooling of the entire global banana industry around the Cavendish was one of the most expensive and logistically complex agricultural transitions in modern history. Plantations had to be completely replanted. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Distribution networks had to be renegotiated. Refrigeration technology had to be upgraded because the Cavendish, with its thinner peel, was significantly more fragile than the Gros Michel and bruised far more easily. This is actually why bananas at the grocery store are always slightly underripe and greenish. The Cavendish needs to be picked early because it cannot handle the journey ripe. The Gros Michel did not have this problem. Another thing the industry lost and never got back. But the Cavendish worked. It grew in the same tropical climates. It was immune to the original strain of Panama disease. It was productive enough to meet demand. And so the industry adopted it, scaled it, and proceeded to do exactly what it had done with the Gros Michel. It planted the same variety everywhere. It propagated it exclusively through clones. It built a vast, profitable, globally integrated monoculture around a single genetic line of a single fruit, knowing full well what had happened the last time. Tropical Race 4. History. Repeating the new strain of Panama disease is called Tropical Race 4. Scientists first identified it in the 1980s in Taiwan and Malaysia. Unlike the original strain that destroyed the Gros Michel, Tropical Race 4 can kill the Cavendish. It has been spreading through banana-growing regions for 4 decades. It has reached Southeast Asia, Australia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America. It was confirmed in Colombia, one of the world's largest banana exporters, in 2019. The industry responded with alarm because Colombia sits at the edge of the Caribbean and Central American growing regions that supply the global export market. Scientists have been warning about Tropical Race 4 since the 1990s. 30 years of warnings. And for most of that time, the industry's response was a combination of biosecurity measures that slowed the spread but did not stop it, and a kind of institutional optimism that could generously be described as hope and less generously described as denial. The fungus spreads the same way the original Panama disease did, through contaminated soil, contaminated water, contaminated equipment. A single muddy boot walking from an infected field to a clean one can carry enough spores to establish a new outbreak. It is almost impossible to contain across a commercial operation involving thousands of workers, hundreds of miles of plantation, and decades of continuous production. If tropical race 4 reaches the major banana-growing regions of Central America at scale, the consequences will not just be higher banana prices at the grocery store. For the roughly 400 million people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for whom bananas and plantains are a primary caloric staple, not a smoothie ingredient, this is a food security crisis. The kind that does not make front pages in wealthy countries until people are already starving. The nutrition, the scale, the absurdity. Before we get to what happens next, let us take a moment to appreciate just how staggering the scale of the modern banana industry actually is. Because it is genuinely absurd and deserves a second of acknowledgement. Approximately 100 billion bananas are consumed every year on this planet. That is roughly 13 bananas for every human being alive, which means that somewhere out there, someone is eating your share and mine to make the average work out. Bananas are the most consumed fruit on Earth. They are the fourth largest agricultural crop in the world by value, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. Over 150 countries produce them. They are grown on approximately 10 million hectares of land globally. They are also, and this is genuinely my favorite banana fact, mildly radioactive. Bananas contain potassium, and a small percentage of all naturally occurring potassium is a radioactive isotope called potassium-40. The amount of radiation you absorb from eating a banana is so minuscule that it is completely harmless, but scientists have actually created a unit of measurement called the banana equivalent dose, or BLED, to help people understand radiation exposure levels in relatable terms. A chest X-ray is roughly equal to 40 banana equivalent doses. A full-body CT scan is roughly equal to 70,000 banana equivalent doses. The fact that radiation physicists sat down and said, you know what, let us make this more accessible, let us use bananas, is the most human thing I have ever heard. Nutritionally, the banana is genuinely impressive. It provides potassium, vitamin B6, vitamin C, magnesium, fiber, and a fast-releasing carbohydrate that makes it one of the most effective natural energy sources available. Athletes have used bananas as a performance food for decades, not because of marketing, but because the nutritional profile is legitimately excellent. And yet a banana at any American grocery store costs roughly 19 cents. A fruit that traveled from a plantation in Ecuador or Guatemala or Colombia was picked by hand, packed in refrigerated containers, shipped thousands of miles across an ocean, unloaded at a port, transported by truck to a distribution center, and driven to your local store. Costs less than a quarter. That price did not appear by magic. It was extracted from somewhere. From the underpaid farm workers on plantations in countries where the political infrastructure was, in many cases, deliberately kept weak and compliant by the same corporate interests that needed cheap labor to make the numbers work. The 19-cent banana is a miracle of logistics and a monument to exploitation, depending on which end of the supply chain you are standing on. What happens next? The people trying to save the banana are working against a clock they cannot fully read. Plant scientists at institutions around the world, including the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and research programs in Australia and Uganda, have been working for years on developing Cavendish varieties that are resistant to tropical race 4. Some of this work involves conventional crossbreeding, which is slow and complicated because the Cavendish, like most commercially cultivated bananas, is a triploid, meaning it has 3 sets of chromosomes instead of the usual 2, which makes it sterile. It does not produce seeds you can breed with. Developing new varieties through conventional methods takes decades. Other researchers have turned to genetic engineering. An Australian scientist named James Dale at Queensland University of Technology has spent years developing a genetically modified Cavendish that incorporates a gene from a wild banana species that confers resistance to tropical race 4. Field trials in Australia showed strong results. The modified bananas survived in soil heavily infected with the fungus, But genetically modified crops face regulatory and public relations hurdles in virtually every major market, particularly in Europe. And the banana industry has historically been slow to embrace anything that might complicate its relationship with consumers who prefer their fruit to feel natural. There is also the seed bank approach. The Global Musa Genomic Consortium and various national agricultural research institutions have been collecting and preserving wild banana varieties for years, building libraries of genetic diversity that could theoretically be drawn upon to breed disease resistance into commercial varieties. Wild bananas, the original seedy, inedible ancestors of the fruit you eat today, contain genetic characteristics that their cultivated descendants were bred out of over thousands of years. Somewhere in that genetic library there may be the resistance the Cavendish needs. Finding it and transferring it is the challenge. And then there is the simplest solution, and the one the industry has been most resistant to. Stop growing one banana. Grow several. Different varieties. Different genetic profiles. A portfolio of bananas rather than a monoculture. This would cost more. It would complicate supply chains. It would require consumers to accept that bananas come in different shapes, sizes, and flavors, which they absolutely did before the industry decided uniformity was more important than resilience. Some specialty grocers and farmers markets already sell red bananas, ladyfinger bananas, plantains, and other varieties. But the global commercial infrastructure is built around one banana, and rebuilding it around several would require a willingness to accept short-term disruption for long-term security that large corporate interests rarely demonstrate voluntarily. We have been here before. We did this before. We watched the Gros Michel disappear and then rebuilt the exact same system around the Cavendish and told ourselves it would be fine. Tropical Race 4 is the universe's way of sending a follow-up email that has not been answered. The banana started as a small, seedy, barely edible jungle plant clinging to the humid slopes of Papua New Guinea, domesticated by anonymous farmers who understood, without ever using the words, that you could improve a crop by choosing the best individuals and propagating them indefinitely. Those farmers gave the world something extraordinary, and the world took it, scaled it, weaponized it, built corporate empires on it, toppled governments for it, and then watched it nearly disappear once already. The Gros Michel is gone. The banana in your kitchen, the one that comes in a bunch and turns brown on your counter faster than you planned, the one that banana-flavored candy no longer resembles, the one that athletes peel on the sidelines and toddlers mash into paste, that banana is the backup plan. It is the inferior substitute that became the world's most consumed fruit by default. And right now, in the soil of plantations across Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America, a fungus that cannot be killed is spreading. Moving slowly, moving quietly, moving with the patience that only something without a brain or a schedule or anything to lose can manage. The people who could stop it are working. The scientists are in their labs. The field researchers are in their test plots. The gene editors are staring at sequences on screens. But the industry is still, for the most part, growing one banana, betting everything on one genetic line. Again, for 400 million people who depend on bananas as a staple food, this is not a quirky food history story. It is a countdown. For the rest of us, it might be worth paying attention before the 19-cent banana becomes a memory and artificial banana flavor becomes the only way anyone alive remembers what the real thing tasted like. Not bad for a fruit most people only think about when it turns brown before Thursday. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which part of the banana's history caught you the most off guard. We cover stories like this every week, and you will want to be here for what comes next.